Good evening. It's late. It's storming. But Freddie Vasquez is on with Basement Politics. And tonight, I want to talk about propaganda in the media. Talk a little bit about what's been happening lately in the world and the propaganda involved. Good evening, folks. I am Freddie Vasquez. This is Basement Politics Unfiltered, late edition. Tonight, propaganda in the media. Are we being told the truth? Or are we constantly being lied to? Guys ever watched The Truman Show? How about Wag the Dog? Have you seen that movie? Let's talk about it. Good evening, folks. I'm coming on late because it's pouring out there, and I got some water in my garage, and I had to clean that out. Pain in the butt. But anyway, I'm on, and I wanted to talk about this because tomorrow's Friday. It's the week in review, so I want to get this episode out the way, and I wanted to speak about propaganda. I also want to talk about the episode I did on the Sage family, Nader Sage and his family. I titled it The Sage Crime Family. That show is causing quite a stir. And I'll be talking about that in a little bit. But first, I want to talk about propaganda. I just want to expose a little bit about what's going on there, folks, just so you can think about things before you just run with it. Many people are running with what they're being told by mainstream media, regardless if it's CNN or Fox News. And we've been seeing that here in our own city of Yonkers with some of the media outlets. And I'll talk about that also. In 2015, I almost made a bet. I almost lost 20 grand, right? And I'm a man that honors my bets. So I almost lost 20 grand as I almost bet someone that Trump would not win and would not be president in 2016. I just didn't believe that he could do it. I didn't believe it. And he won. He won, right? And unfortunately, well, I say fortunately for me, I didn't make the bet. I didn't believe that Trump had a snowball's hell chance in hell. I say a snowball's chance in hell of winning. As we all know, I was very wrong. Not only did I not see Trump winning, none of us would have imagined what the next 8 years would bring. Yeah, we've been through quite a bit of trauma. I'm going to call it trauma. We've been traumatized in the past 8 years. We've been through quite a lot. It was quite the ride, but for many, their eyes began to open up to something Trump labeled fake news or misinformation. Let me be clear. This is not about supporting Trump or hating Trump. No, this is about the blatant propaganda or fake news that I've been seeing lately and many others have been seeing lately. However, it wasn't until the pandemic that more and more people began to question the mainstream news reporting, including myself. It's like once you started to notice it, you just couldn't unsee it, right? It was everywhere. Even big name journalists, and I use the word journalist lightly, were caught traumatizing, quote unquote, stories like dramatizing stories like Anderson Cooper, CNN's Anderson Cooper, who was caught standing in a drainage ditch, right, full of water to make it appear as the flooding from a storm he was covering was worse than it really was. Or when the hospital had its staff members line up their cars to make it appear that the drive-through test site that was busy with people coming to get tested. That turned out to be a lie. And while I can go on for hours about the false information or fake news in regards to the pandemic, I want to talk about the one thing that was able to eliminate COVID-19. Yes, because there is a cure for COVID-19, and that was the Russian invasion of Ukraine. If this is anything like the Russian collusion allegations that led to an attempt to impeach Trump, then this is totally false. And why do I say that? Because what the mainstream media does not want you to know is that the whole Russia collusion thing was a hoax. So they simply quietly admitted it and moved on. But is it over? Right? According to the front page of a recent New York Post article, I should say the edition, the fact that Hillary Clinton created the dossier that implicated Trump in the Russian collusion scandal, or had she ordered for it to have to be created, could see the former Secretary of State in court and behind bars. That's right, because it's coming out now that it was all a setup in order to impeach Trump or to make Trump look bad, right? So that was all fake. The Russian collusion was fake. But again, it's not about Trump. This is about fake news and propaganda. So our reports on mainstream media regarding the recent a situation in Ukraine, the recent invasion of Ukraine by Russia, truth, or are we being lied to? Let's start by understanding the conflict in Eastern Europe, right? And that's the thing. A lot of people just don't know the history of that region. So they're talking about it, and basically just parroting what CNN or other, talking heads like myself, I'm a talking head, right, are saying. Right. And then they swear by it. They will fight you to the death like that's the truth. Now, to truly understand what ultimately the conflict between Russia and Ukraine is about, we must go back, and we don't have that much time. So for the sake of time, I'll give you the Cliff Notes version. Basically, the Ukraine has a history of being invaded, annexed, or conquered. Most recently, the Ukraine was a part of the former USSR, now Russia. It became independent once again when the USSR broke up in the early 90s. As a result, there were a lot of political changes within Russia and in the region in general. Bottom line, Russia agreed to leave Ukraine and other states independent that had broken off once USSR split up. However, according to the agreement they made, NATO, right, were supposed to give them space. They were not supposed to push further into Europe, into Eastern Europe. Now, what is NATO? NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And according to Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, right, NATO began accepting more and more Eastern European nations into NATO, encroaching upon Russia's borders. What does that mean, essentially? That as a member of NATO, you are now allies with all the other members of NATO, which includes some of Russia's biggest economic and military competitors, as well as just blatant enemies, right? So would you want a friend of your enemies in your backyard? And that's how you have to look at it. Putin claims that NATO broke the agreement and has been warning NATO ever since. Something else to consider is that Ukraine, right, is kind of it's a one country, but it's kind of divided into Eastern Ukraine and Western Ukraine. And I want to play a video here to kind of give you a little bit of the background of what's going on there.
The US and NATO created this crisis because they tossed aside the reasonable demands of the Russian Federation in two draft treaties submitted on December 21st, 2021. One of the key demands was for a neutral Ukraine and a binding pledge that it would never join NATO. For his part, Ukrainian President Zelensky dismissed the Minsk protocols, which was the only formula to solve the impasse over the breakaway republics in Donetsk and Luhansk. The Minsk protocols required the Ukrainian government to negotiate with the breakaway region concerning the restoration of its previous autonomy, as well as language and cultural rights prior to the Maidan coup in 2014. These failures left the Russian-speaking people of the Donbass alone to suffer the increasing military onslaught of the Ukrainian government, riddled with neo-Nazi parties and egged on by Western arms and money. All of these reasons and 3 decades of betrayal by the United States and NATO of their pledges in the early 1990s to Gorbachev, the last Soviet president, that NATO wouldn't expand 1 inch eastward of a reunited Germany is why we see these moves from Russia today. However, in the past 30 years, rather than dissolving itself because it was set up to protect North Atlantic countries from the alleged danger of communism, NATO expanded 800 kilometers to the east and admitted 14 states which had been broke away from the former Soviet Union or were former members of the Warsaw Pact. Western military and naval forces were stationed in these new NATO member countries, and NATO installed missile systems and held massive drills close to Russia's diminished borders.
Soviet Empire has
So there you have it. A little bit of the history there. Russia agreed to let Ukraine be an independent nation. However, they also agreed that NATO would not push forward more east into Europe and closer to the borders of Russia. Now, very recently, Zelensky, right, the guy in charge of Ukraine, who, by the way, if you don't know, was a comedian 2 years ago. He was a comedic actor, no political experience. And he actually made a movie. He produced a movie and starred in the movie in which a regular guy somehow becomes the president of the country, right? And he even created the party that was in the movie. So the fake party that he was a part of in the movie, he actually created it in real life and then became the president under that party. Yeah, so it's really like a movie that's going on. So then Zelensky was now asking NATO to invite him in. He wanted to be a member of NATO. Now, we can go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Are you familiar with that? Where Russia attempted to put missiles on Cuban soil. That didn't turn out too well. John F. Kennedy put up a bunch of naval ships and put a blockade and made the Russian ships turn back around. They actually made a movie about that. There was like a little standoff there for a while. But why did the United States react that way? That could have led to World War III. And we've always been on like this brink with Russia, right, on World War III. It's always like this enemy, like, the Red Scare and the Cold War. And then now we have Cold War 2.0, right? So if John F. Kennedy didn't want missiles in Cuba, which I get, we don't want missiles 90 miles south of Miami, right? Why would Russia and Putin want us to put, or not us, but NATO, which includes America, to put missiles in Ukraine? Right. And the reason why I said there's a difference or there's a kind of like a divided Ukraine is because there's Eastern Ukraine and there's Western Ukraine. Eastern Ukraine still has close ties to Russia. Many of the individuals that live there are Russians. They speak Russian and they still have family ties to Russia. I mean, it's right there on the border. Right. And then Eastern Ukraine has a unique relationship with Germany that goes back to Nazi Germany, which is why you may have heard some things about Nazis in Ukraine and stuff like that. And mainstream media is trying to downplay that because they don't want people to say, wait a minute, these are Nazis. But the fact is that there is a large segment of that population in Eastern Ukraine that are a part of the Nazi Party movement. And I will show you that as well here in a second, right? So again, so what is the truth, right? What is truly happening over there? Are we being lied to? Are we living through a real life Wag the Dog situation? And if you don't know, Wag the Dog was a movie about, our government creating a fake war, right? And they even have like, the green screen, and they have this woman running with a cat, and then they make it appear like she's in this war-torn, country, and they're bombing it and everything. It's basically almost like what's happening in Russia. Some country invaded that country and they're showing the lady running for her life. And then they decide whether they're going to put a cat or a dog in her arms. And they want to get the people of America to really support this. And folks, history is so important to know because throughout our history, our government has done things in order to get the support of the people and Congress, back when Congress was somewhat independent, right, in order to approve going to war. Why? Because war makes people money, particularly the military industrial complex, as well as the central banks who loan money to countries. That's right, because we, as the American country, we have to borrow money from the Federal Reserve. Yes, and we have to pay back interest on our own money to give to our people. And essentially, who do they pass that interest down onto? That be us, right? So anyway, quick question: how many have taken statistics in class? In college, I know I have. If experts are seeking to find an answer to a question such as how many people, let's say, support the changes going on in Yonkers, right? And let's say realistically, they can't ask every single person, right? So they'll take a small group a small sample size of the population, and based off that sample size, they'll make a determination or a hypothesis, right? I'll come up with a probability of whether or not people support the changes that are happening in Yonkers, the development, right? So if we look at that in terms of our media outlet and what's been going on social media in terms of fake news, like the Yonkers Tribune putting out these articles on individuals just to do political hit jobs, and concern Yonkers of Democrats, another Facebook page that's just created to cause problems and put out misinformation, then we have to say that it probably happens on a national level, I would imagine, and an international level. So we have to not be naive and be so trusting of our government sometimes in the media, because sometimes we don't trust them, but then sometimes we do for whatever reason. And this is not against Ukraine or anybody, Ukrainian people, please. This is, again, about propaganda within our media, and are we being told the truth when we watch CNN or Fox News, which I personally don't watch anymore. I want to show you another video here and kind of give you a backstory of the U.S. involvement in this whole fiasco before it's even got to where we at now. I mean, again, what else is coming out to be a fact? The Hunter Biden laptop. That's right, folks. That was a conspiracy. People, that's a conspiracy. But it's coming out to be a fact. It's coming out. And many political experts are saying that the reason why now they're mentioning it to be a fact and that it's starting to be leaked is because they're done with Biden. The guys who run the show, the real people who run the show, because it's not Biden, are done with Biden. They're ready to move on, and now they're going to throw him under the bus. He did a whole lot of stuff over there with Hunter Biden. Think about this. Nancy Pelosi, Hunter Biden, and a few other elected officials have kids who all have jobs in energy companies in the Ukraine. That's right. Energy companies, they are executives there. Hunter Biden had an $800,000 a year, basically no-show job at some energy company in the Ukraine. Why? And those are the questions we need to be asking as a country, and not, kind of battling each other, the people, over whether or not these liars, right, that have been elected, or maybe not, are telling us, right? So we have to really think about that. Like, we can't just always jump to believe these people, regardless of what party, Republican or Democrat. Again, that's what basement politics does. I want to share the truth on politics.
Nearly every case reported by the mainstream media, they have omitted the United States' extensive role in the 2014 coup that preceded Russia's annexation of Crimea. Focusing on just the latter part, the annexation of Crimea, only serves to manufacture consent for United States intervention abroad and for tougher sanctions on Russia. The backdrop to the 2014 coup and annexation cannot be understood without looking at the United States' strategy to open Ukrainian markets to foreign investors and give control of its economy to giant multinational corporations. A key tool for this has been the International Monetary Fund, which leverages aid loans to push governments to adopt policies friendly to foreign investors. The IMF is funded by and represents Western financial capital and governments, and has been at the forefront of efforts to reshape economies around the world for decades, often with disastrous results. The civil war in Yemen and the coup in Bolivia both followed a rejection of IMF terms. In Ukraine, the IMF had long planned to implement a series of economic reforms to make the country more attractive to investors. In 2013, after early steps to integrate with the West, Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych turned against these changes and ended trade integration talks with the European Union. Months before his overthrow, he restarted economic negotiations with Russia, in a major snub to the Western economic sphere. By then, the nationalist protests were heating up that would go on to topple his government. During this tug-of-war between the deep state and Russia, the Americans were engaged in a destabilization campaign against the Yanukovych government. After the 2014 coup, the new government quickly restarted the EU deal. The campaign culminated with the overthrow of the elected president in the Maidan Revolution, also known as the Maidan Coup or the Maidan Massacre, named for the Kiev square that hosted the bulk of the...
So what they're talking about there is the former leader of Ukraine, right? He cut ties off. He stopped negotiating with, Western countries, NATO and stuff like that, and started to do deals with Russia. They didn't like that. Ukraine had a lot of there were things there such as these energy companies. They're doing a pipeline over there, an oil pipeline. So they needed a government that was friendly. The United States needed a government that was friendly to the Western powers. That guy switched on them. What they do? Look at what was done. This is exactly what's happening here in the United States. I mean, folks, this is not a conspiracy. This is in your face right here. What they did was they went into the Ukraine and created a coup, right? And it started just before Christmas. They sent in guys there who were supposed to be putting up the Christmas tree, but it really was some, soldiers that were part of the, the coup and stuff like that. And then they attacked the people, and they said, well, because we wanted to put the Christmas tree up, even though the president has said, don't worry about it, let them protest, right? But then who gave that order for them to go in there anyway and break up the protesters? Well, it was a gentleman that was friendly with United States officials and had been meeting with them and taking phone calls with them. So this is all documented, right? But the CNN and Fox News will not play this stuff. They won't play the phone calls from U.S. officials talking about how they're going to do this stuff. So they overthrew this government and put in a puppet government. This is something the United States has done time and time again, which is why we have so much animosity towards us from other countries and other groups of people. And we have to blame the elected officials. And they're not doing this for our freedom. They're sending our relatives, our loved ones, military men and women to fight for benefits of corporations, greedy bankers, right? And politicians who want to make money. That's what a lot of it is all about. So when they say they're fighting for your freedom, I hate to say that's not true, because no one wants to offend our men and women in uniform. Absolutely not. I give them a lot of respect, but the reality is they get sent to get slaughtered for the sake of the 1%. And that's a fact. And just think about it on a micro scale here in the city of Yonkers, when you have the elite, and who suffers? The 99%. And what do? They do things for the benefit of themselves, right? And you see the time again. So you have to equate that to on a national and a global scale, right? And this is just, again, why I'm showing this stuff, because it's important to understand and truly learn. So
As
we are not,
turmoil
going
the
along with
country
something that's ultimately hurting our country, because who are the ones suffering? It's not the elite. They're asking us to make sacrifices, but they make
lead
money.
Up to 2014,
they make money.
The United States was fueling anti-government sentiment through mechanisms like USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy. And
by the way, really quick, that USAID, this is like some of these organizations here in Yonkers again also, and throughout New York, right? USAID, they also have Israeli aid, right? So this is one organization by one group of people, but they have them spread out in different parts of the world. And Israeli aid was very big because they were in the news for bringing in migrants. They were like going to other countries. Israeli citizens who were part of Israeli aid were going to European countries, or like England and stuff like that. And they were bringing in the migrants who were coming in there out of the water and helping them out and bringing them into a country that wasn't even theirs. Like, how do you just go do that? Right? Because they say, well, that's our cause. But why don't you bring them to Israel then? Huh? Why are you going to another country and bringing them into that other country while you guys build a big wall around Israel? I'm just saying, that's it, and Israel, they're not too fond of, people migrating there, let's just say.
NED, just as they had done in 2004's Color Revolution.
U.S. campaign behind the turmoil in Kiev.
In December 2013, Newland, Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs and a longtime regime change advocate, said that the United States government had spent $5 billion promoting democracy in Ukraine since 1991. The money went towards supporting senior officials in the Ukraine government, members of the business
Doesn't that look like
community,
stuff
as
you
well
see
as
here in Yonkers when they do these little political events when they're just trying to get your money and stuff like that, right? You know what I'm saying? Look, U.S. Ukraine Foundation presents. So all this again, they're always trying to get our money, folks. These rich people are always trying to steal our money somehow. Always, always, always.
opposition civil society who agree with United States goals.
The world is watching the drama that is unfolding in the center of Kyiv. The Euromaidan movement has come to embody the principles and values that are the cornerstones for all free democracies. What began on November 24th as a protest against President Yanukovych's decision to pause on the route to Europe has become much deeper and bigger.
Is this political conference
After blood was
sponsored by
spilled by
Chevron?
security forces on November 30th, the movement also became about justice and civil rights. Later that same day, I spent more than 2 hours with President Yanukovych. It was a tough conversation, but also a realistic one. But I also made clear that the United States believes there is a way out for Ukraine, that it is still possible to save Ukraine's European future, and that is where we wanted to see the president lead his country. And that was going to require immediate steps to de-escalate the security situation and immediate political steps to end the crisis and get Ukraine back into a conversation with Europe and with the International Monetary Fund. The reforms that the IMF insists on are necessary for the long-term economic health of the country. A new deal with the IMF would also send a positive signal to private markets and would increase foreign direct investment that is so urgently needed in Ukraine. Signing the association agreement with the EU would also put Ukraine on a path to strengthening the sort of stable and predictable business environment that investors require. There is no other path that would bring Ukraine back to long-term political stability and economic growth. As Vice President Biden said in remarks last night, President Yanukovych has a choice. He can choose the path that leads to division and isolation, or he can take a leap and take immediate, tangible steps to defuse his country's crisis and start a genuine dialogue with the opposition and agree on a path that returns Ukraine to economic and political health.
On February 27th, Yatsenuk became the prime minister.
Я хочу вам сказать, вы затронули
The Washington-backed opposition that toppled the government was fueled by far-right and openly Nazi elements like the Right Sector.
The most prominent among these extremist groups is an organization called Svoboda. The Svoboda Party, which traces its roots to the Ukrainian Partisan Party of World War II, was loosely allied with Nazi Germany. Until 2004, Svoboda had been called the Social Nationalist Party, a deliberate reference to the National Socialism of the Nazis. And we're not throwing the term neo-Nazi around here as an empty slur. The leader of Svoboda, Oleg Tanibok, has openly targeted Jews and ethnic Russians in Ukraine for many years. In 2004, he was kicked out of Viktor Yushchenko's government for a speech calling for Ukrainians to fight against a, quote, Muscovite Jewish mafia. And in 2005, he signed his name to an open letter to the leadership of Ukraine entitled, Stop the Criminal Activities of Organized Jewry. And none of this was a secret. The BBC was already reporting on the danger that Svoboda's rise posed back in 2012. And the EU passed a resolution that same year condemning Svoboda as, quote, racist, anti-Semitic, and xenophobic. Yet somehow the US government thought it was appropriate to back these extremists. This is a picture of Victoria Nuland from the US State Department meeting with Oleg Tanibok in February. And this is a picture of Senator John McCain sharing a stage with Tanibok in December. But why would the US government work with neo-Nazis? Because they thought that they could control the situation. They thought that they could install their puppets behind the scenes and manipulate the situation in their favor.
One far-right group that grew out of the protests was the Azov Battalion, a paramilitary militia of neo-Nazi extremists. Their leaders made up the vanguard of the anti-Yanukovych protests and even spoke at opposition events in the Maidan alongside regime change advocates like McCain and Nuland.
Act 1. Ukrainian father says goodbye to his daughter before sending her away from danger. He is staying behind to fight for Ukraine. There are some who preen and posture about masculinity. They go on and on about male strength and insist on their own power. But when evil comes, they end up siding with the aggressor. And then there's men like this. Except this man, according to his own posts, is in fact Russian and fighting Ukraine.
Okay, here we go. 30 minutes ago by CNN. Watch this.
This is Maiden Square. As you can see, so this is where the revolutionary protests were held in 2014 against the then Yanukovych government. Lots of people around, people getting coffee. There are more soldiers around. There's certain sentry posts around. I spoke to a soldier who confirmed to me that there was an explosion somewhere at an airport, but I was not able to get any confirmation which airport, to what extent. He told me it was tactical. But there's no panic on the streets. I woke up to a very loud alarm in my hotel, but as I scrambled outside, there's not a great deal going on. So this is what it looks like here. I'll keep you all posted. Peace and love to Ukraine.
Ukraine video is a video game called Arma 3. I play it.
Look at this. That's the footage that you were talking about. Remember that. Now I want you to pay attention to this. Same type of footage, right? Remember the plane? I said, remember the shape of the plane? That's an A-10. Reason why I know, because this is part of a video game that I play called Arma 3. It's a combat simulation. It's exactly what the video is. So I'm sorry, like I said, what you saw was a video game. I've been playing it for years.
The vast majority of the fake news that we see circulating is anti-Russian. So I'll be debunking a lot of this type of information. It was being reported that 13 heroic soldiers on Snake Island were confronted by a Russian warship. The audio recording shows the Russians telling the Ukrainians to lay down their arms to avoid bloodshed and unjustified deaths. The Ukrainians are infamously heard saying, "Russian warship, go F yourself." It was then reported they fought valiantly until they were all killed by the Russians. President Zelensky even announced he would posthumously award the men medals of valor. Well, it turns out whomever claimed they had died was mistaken. Instead, the Ukrainian border guard disputed whether anyone was killed, and shortly after, video footage emerged of the Russians giving food and water to the 82 men, not 13, from Snake Island, who were then being transferred to Crimea.
Oh, I didn't realize my mic was on mute. What I was saying there before is that the woman there was talking about the fact that they it's crazy, it's unbelievable. They claim that Russians had slaughtered these Ukrainian soldiers, but in fact, I have my mic on mute. I'm sorry to let you hear it's rain in the background. I don't want that to come in, but they claim that these Russian soldiers slaughtered these Ukrainian border patrol guard soldiers or whatever, and even the president of Ukraine was perpetuating the story and even awarded them. They got awards posthumously after death, but that never happened. It wasn't even true. And the Russian president, I should say the Ukrainian president, is perpetuating that lie and even saying he's going to give them an award for their heroic efforts and being killed. But again, like I said, if there's anything that you take away from this podcast, I hope that it's this. I want you to remember this video. I think this is important.
24th of February. The dialer was my American friend from my high school days in the US. He was the last person I expected to call, especially at 7:30 in the morning. I knew immediately that the war has actually broken out. The beginning of the war did not surprise me. In fact, it's long overdue. What surprised me was the fact that he knew nothing about the suffering that the Russian Ukrainians had endured over the past 8 years. Let me get something straight. NATO promised that they wouldn't move an inch to the east. That was a lie. And now we are surrounded by an aggressive military alliance. NATO gladly bombed Yugoslavia under the pretenses of potential genocide. Did they bomb just military installations? No. NATO destroyed schools, hospitals, bridges, cultural monuments, private businesses, and industrial plants. Did you forget about that? Did you forget about how NATO pumped money and weapons into Georgia right before Georgia bombarded Russian peacekeepers and civilians? Of course you did, because your media doesn't want you to know. Did you forget how yet another territory was ripped away from Serbia? Do you not remember Kosovo? Did you protest then? I bet you didn't, and I bet you didn't even care. Did you forget the invasion of Libya? If you're in Europe, you can't forget. Thousands of migrants are your daily reminder of what your governments did to that country. Did you protest the illegal invasion of Syria by Turkey and the US? I bet you didn't. Do you care about Saudi Arabia starving Yemen? I bet you don't. Do you care, or did you care, about the illegal invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan under false pretenses? What, they aren't people to you? Why haven't you been vocal against the murder of children and civilians at Iraqi and Afghani weddings by American bombardment? Ah, that's right. They're brown people. They're probably worth less to you. Where were your crocodile tears when Kiev started bombarding Ukrainian Russians in the east simply for doing the exact same thing as the Ukrainians did in the west, was to get rid of a corrupt government? Where were your crocodile tears when Kiev shut off electricity and water to Crimea? Where was your Save the Ukrainian People when 48 civilian anti-Maidan Ukrainian protesters were rounded into a Union trade house and burned alive, whilst those who tried to escape the fiery hell were beaten and shot? Do you by any chance know who the Madonna of Gorlovka is? Do you know what the Alley of Angels memorial is? Let me give you a hint. People engraved into that memorial aren't alive, and they are not adults. Did you shed even one digital virtue signaling tear when the children at the children's beach in Zagreb were purposefully bombed by the Ukrainian military using illegal cluster bombs? I bet you didn't. But that's okay. How would you? Your mainstream media keeps you in the dark. For 8 years, the US and its allies have been pumping billions of dollars worth of lethal weapons into Ukraine. For 8 years, the Ukrainians have been waging a war with their own people in the east. And for 7 years, Russia and the people of the Donetsk and Lugansk republics have been patiently waiting for Kiev to adhere to the Minsk agreements. Should Russia have waited maybe 20 more years? You know, the amount of years that the U.S. spent killing Afghanis. So whilst leaders like Boris Johnson, Joe Biden, Emmanuel Macron, Olaf Scholz, and Ursula von der Leyen have been virtue signaling about the poor Ukrainians, they have been robbing the Ukrainians of their dignity, making their economy run on loans from the IMF, and basically robbing them of their future. And Russia is to blame when we were their primary trading partner. The West pushed Russia into a corner. Protect yourself from an increasingly hostile neighbor who wants to become part of a hostile military alliance called NATO and lose Nord Stream 2, for example. Or watch Russian Ukrainians get slaughtered by the thousands. The West wanted to fight this war with Russia until the very last Ukrainian. Remember Kosovo? Well, the Lugansk and Donetsk republics have every right to exist. Russia didn't set the precedent. Your leaders did when they recognized Kosovo. And final food for thought. Why was there no bombardment of innocent civilians in Crimea, even though it's closer to Kiev than Donetsk is? I'll give you a hint. The actual Russian military was there protecting the people. Here's another. The Ukrainian army has been fighting this invisible Russian army for 8 years now in the east, according to your mainstream media. Why then did the Ukrainian army collapse within 24 hours when fighting the actual Russian military? And since it did, what do you think your tax dollars were doing in Ukraine? That's right. Your tax dollars were used by Ukrainians in the West to kill Ukrainians in the East, and you didn't give a flying fuck about it. So if you haven't been following this conflict from day one, and now you put the blue and yellow flag on your photo, wipe away your crocodile tears, please, and find out why your governments have been supporting those who have made a Nazi criminal, Stepan Bandera, their national war hero. Don't expect a good result from pushing a bear and a dragon into a corner. And definitely don't.
Folks, I got to agree with the guy there. Again, he made a lot of good points. He made a lot of great points. And my point is simply, do your research. Do your homework. Do not go along quickly with what you hear on CNN or what many of these elected officials are saying. Recently, I have been learning that we are simply being lied to on a bigger scale than we could ever have imagined. I mean, I'm not just assuming this or believing this and thinking this. I know this from evidence that I've seen. Facts. The man just made a lot of great points, and I think that we need to think about what's going on over in the Ukraine and Russia and how it's truly impacting us here in America. Is this simply a U.S. war by proxy using the Ukrainian people to fight against the Russians? Does the United States truly care about Ukraine? And are the Bidens, the Clintons, and the Pelosi's truly or really making money over there like they say? Yes, they are. The information is out there. You have to just research it, read it, and believe it. The same way you believe the propaganda on CNN and Fox News. I'm Freddie Vasquez. This is Basement Politics, Unfiltered. Tonight, propaganda in the media. It exists. It's very real. Censorship is extremely real. And many of you got it wrong on the Russia-Ukraine situation. And that's a fact, folks. Peace on earth. Peace on earth. We just want peace. We should all be supporting no war. We should all support talks and peace. We should also question why our elected officials have spent so much money, so much of our money, taxpayer money, in the Ukraine. Why are our elected officials ever involved in any coup d'etat and even assassination attempts? That's right, because the former president of the Ukraine was almost killed in an assassination attempt by mercenaries. Who paid them? Who sent them over there? Folks, I'm Freddie Vasquez. You should know by now we are all getting played. You should know by now that this is,
like I said, political games that are being played. You could have,
like Tasha Diaz said, political games. Have a good night.
Like I said, political games that are being played. You could have, like I said, political games that are being played. Like I said, political games that are being played. You could have.
You're watching Basement Politics with my dad, Freddie Vasquez.
Freddie wins. Fatality.
Join me tomorrow for my weekend review. Don't forget, folks, I will be on tomorrow with the weekend review. And I didn't talk about the Sage crime family fallout, but there is some fallout, and I will discuss tomorrow in my Friday weekend review. Shout out to the White Plains realtor who I spoke with earlier this evening. Thank you for the compliments. I appreciate it. And I look forward to speaking with you. Take care, folks. Have a good night. TGIF. I'll see you tomorrow night. Be blessed.
Freddy wins. Fatality.